But sometimes in mystical experiences, the changes are even more dramatic. Now, I don't know, people in this audience may not be so interested in mystical experience, but I am, and I think there's good evidence that there is conformity in the types of mystical experiences people have. And so this is a quote from Ed Kelly: "There is an interesting similarity between the description of mystical experiences produced through the stages of samadhi, characterized by Patanjali, and an early anatomist twisting the focus of a microscope. It's as though the meditator is adjusting the focal length of his speech is present and encountering systematically different worlds depending on the settings achieved." So the point I'm making is this: our conscious experience involves a certain specious present. Why do we suppose that the only experience of consciousness is one based on a specious present of a second? Why should there not be levels of consciousness with a much smaller specious present, maybe a nanosecond? Maybe a computer has a specious present of a nanosecond. Or maybe there are even levels of with a specious present of 1,000,000 years. All these different levels of consciousness will be unaware of each other, but they could exist. And so the question, therefore, is ours the only level of consciousness in the universe? Now, I just want to, and in my own approach, I associate the specious present with these. So I haven't asked the question, what are these higher dimensions? And I actually associate them with, I associate a hierarchy of compactified dimensions with the specious present. But this is very speculative, even more speculative than everything I've said up to now. So the final question I just want to end on is consciousness generated by the brain? Obviously, that's the mainstream view. A person's mental activities are due to the behavior of nerve cells, glial cells, and the atoms, ions, and molecules that make up the brain, by Sir Francis Crick. Marvin Minsky, the brain is just a computer made of meat. That is the mainstream view, maybe not the meat view, but at least that the brain is the generator of consciousness. But there is the other view. Steve Pinker says, how could consciousness possibly arise from the brain? Beats the heck out of me. I have some prejudices, but no idea of how to begin to look for a defensible answer, and neither does anybody else. Nobody has the faintest idea what consciousness is. I don't have any idea, nor does anybody else, include the philosophers of mind. So, and I made clear in my question to Sarah that I actually don't think the brain produces consciousness. The evidence for the non-local mind, for example, comes from the findings of psychical research, though I appreciate that this is controversial. Dean Radin: minds are entangled with the universe, so in principle minds can non-locally influence anything, including a collection of other minds or physical systems. William Broad: it may be that our deep interconnectedness with each other and with all of nature is the major conclusion that issues forth from many findings of consciousness research. But you don't have to refer to psi, which is controversial. Even creativity may suggest there's a connection between minds. Edison: people say I've created things. I've never created anything. I get impressions from the universe at large and work them out. But I'm only a plate on a record or a receiving apparatus. Thoughts are really impressions that we get from outside. And Mahler: my symphony will be something that the world has never heard before. I tell you, at certain places in the score, a certain uncanny feeling takes possession of me, and I feel as if I had not created this myself. So what all this suggests is that in some sense there is a universal mind, that consciousness is unitary. So Emerson says there's one mind common to all individual men, a universal mind. Deep down, the consciousness of mankind is one. This is a virtual certainty, and if we don't see it, it's because we are blinding ourselves to it. That is David Bohm, the physicist. And this is what gives rise to the filter view, which I mentioned to Sarah, by Aldous Huxley. Each one of us is potentially mind at large, but insofar as we are animals, our business at all costs is to survive, to make biological survival possible. Mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and the nervous system. What comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness which help us to stay alive on the planet of this, on the surface of this particular planet. So this is the view which I'm pushing, and which in some sense underlies this concept of the universal structure, because the universal structure is in some sense related to what's called here the universal mind. And so the idea, the standard view is that that through the history of the Big Bang, you build up greater levels of complexity. You know, you build up quarks and gluons and atoms and molecules, and then you form planets which generate living organisms, and that eventually ends up with evolution giving you consciousness. And so that's the standard view which most reductionist physicists would have, that consciousness is just the culmination of complexity which is built up since the Big Bang. And that would be the view that brain generates consciousness. So how can that possibly be consistent with the idea that there is some universal mind? Well, I draw the picture like this. I say that right at the bottom, consciousness underlies everything. So you can see I'm veering towards a sort of rather idealistic perspective in which consciousness with a big C underlies everything, and the brain is just a filter of that consciousness, rather like a TV set. Now, of course, this is not the mainstream view among physicists, but nevertheless, that's my own personal way I want to go. And so the question is, the fundamental question is, what is the nature of identity? Even if you believe the brain generates consciousness, to me, the great puzzle is, why am I me and not Bernardo? And to me, there's a fundamental link between the problem of what is now and the question of the problem of who am I? Why am I me and not Bernardo? And I think this is intimately linked to the concept of specious present, because I am only separate from Bernardo from the perspective of the specious present of a tenth of a second. And if there are different levels of consciousness with different specious presents, then that separation becomes an illusion. Well, I must conclude now. I'm sorry if I've overshot my time, I'm not even sure. But my conclusion is that an extended space and time plays a crucial role in linking matter, mind, and even spirit, though I know that word puts some people off, and relating individual to universal mind. So if I start with my original diagram, the question mark's been replaced by higher dimensions of space and time, and I'll just end with a little quote from Paul Bronton: "We must learn to mentalize space and spatialize mind." So thank you very much, and sorry, Bernardo, if I've overrun.
Bernard, you alluded to the idealist view that at the ground level of reality there is only one mind, one universal subject. And one of the conceptual difficulties with this view is, how do we explicitly conceptualize how this one subject can have multiple points of view, separate points of view at the same time? I mean, we know something like this happens in nature because of the phenomenon of psychiatric dissociation, but it is nonetheless difficult to make explicit conceptual sense of this, because you see, it's very easy to see how one mind can take on different points of view. For instance, I can play chess with myself. I can play a move for white on one side of the table, then I can stand up, go around the table, sit on the other side, and play a move for black, and then come back and play another move for white. So I can take on many separate points of view, but not at the same time. The difficulty is in imagining how one subject can play for white and for black at the same time, how the universal subject in you can be the same subject in me while we talk to each other. So emphasis on how this can happen at the same time. So my question is, do you think a view of time as something that is more than just unidimensional, something that is more than just linear, a multi-dimensional view of time, as you seem to be putting forward, do you think this can help us make sense of this idealist conundrum?
Thank you, Bernardo. That's such an important question. I mean, it's all very well to say that there's only one mind, you know, this universal mind, or only one consciousness, but the fundamental question is, why and how has that consciousness fragmented into these millions of little consciousnesses with a little c that's on this planet, and there are presumably billions of others elsewhere in the universe? And that's the real mystery. But I mean, but rather than talking about billions, let's just talk about you and me. Why, if your brain produces your consciousness and my brain produces my consciousness, or even if my mind, even if the brain is a filter, why am I associated with with me, sorry, rather than you. And of course, you can have a rather mystical view. You can say, well, you've got some soul, some subtle body which is associated with which has got anchored to your brain, and I've got another subtle body which is anchored to my brain. But then that doesn't solve the problem, because you still got to say, well, why was I associated with that subtle body? I mean, obviously, most people don't believe in subtle bodies, but even if you do, you've got to ask that question. Now, and I don't claim to have a definite answer to that, but my answer, as far as I can give it, is as follows: that it's all to do with time. I mean, you asked the question, how can I be split into different consciousnesses at the same time? Okay, so now at this moment in time, at this moment in physical time, you're Bernardo and I'm Bernard. But if in this picture I'm discussing, you have a hierarchy of dimensions which are associated with a hierarchy of times. And it's a hierarchy in the sense that you saw how time 2 was in some sense incorporating all of time 1. So from the perspective of this 5D observer, five-dimensional observer, all of space and time coexisted. If your level of consciousness is operating on that level, then that's a different time, so that from that level you and me may coexist, but from the point of view of the experience of that higher observer, you might only be one person. So from the four-dimensional perspective, we're all people, but the distinction, the nature of identity is associated with the fact that you have this extra dimension, this extra time. So in other words, we're all the same now, but when you say we coexist at the same time, you have to ask, what time do you mean? And then the question is, also, I've already said that consciousness depends upon the nature of the specious present. And so our being separated is only relative to a particular specious present. At a higher level of consciousness, if I can use that phrase, you have a bigger specious present in which we may just be indistinguishable. And I don't want to make it sound as though I've got a definite answer to this, because I still don't myself understand the concept of the specious present. In some sense, I'm trying to relate the specious present with the higher dimensions which come out of modern physics. I'm just trying to illustrate in principle how you might try and make a link between ideas in physics and ideas to do with conscious experience. But I don't for a moment want to claim that this is definitely the right view. Almost no other physicist is going to agree with me. But I just think I'm trying to demonstrate in principle that it's possible to relate physics to mental experience. Thank you for that question.
Fascinating.